We've been building up our knowledge of Node and Express by looking at the core request and response objects, and then how we can have different functionality for different requests, and how we can get data from the user. In the next few lessons, we'll start to put all these together into a full-fledged web application where we're serving content based on different functionality in our app. Let's start with the example with which we ended the last lesson, which was this form that the user can submit and would send data to the server using a post method. In this case, the user enters her name and clicks that she likes dogs and birds, and then can submit the form. After submitting the form, we want to show a message that says, "Hello, nice to meet you," and then a list of the animals that the user likes, that is, the ones that she selected from the checkboxes. As we can see here, this would be the /handle form URI. So let's see how we would write our Node Express app to get the form data from the user and then send back this HTML content. In this example, I've omitted some of the code that we've seen in all of the previous examples, for instance, requiring Express and creating our app and then starting our server, so that we can focus on the important parts of this example. At the top, as we saw last time, we're going to need to use the body parser middleware because the data coming from the user is part of the form that was submitted using an HTTP post request. For this particular URI, we have our callback function that's going to create a variable called name, which will be the username from our form. And remember, the body parser middleware would put the form data into the body property of the request. We'll also have a variable called animals, which we want to be an array of the animals that the user clicked from the checkboxes. One of the tricks or properties that we need to work around is that the animal property in the body of the request will be a single value if the user only selected one checkbox, but will be an array if they select more than one. And we want this to be an array no matter what. So here's a little JavaScript trick. I'll start with an empty array, and then I'll use the concat function to concatenate whatever is in the body of the request with that empty array. If animal is a single value, then it will be added to that array, and the array will contain just that one value. If animal is an array, then all of the elements of that array will be concatenated with my empty array, so I get back the same thing. Now I'll start to send back my HTML content by setting the content type to HTML and the status code to 200. Now let's go back and look at that HTML page, noting that we're saying hello, nice to meet you, and including the value that the user entered as the username. We have some more static content here, and then this dynamically generated unordered list with the values that the user selected from the checkboxes, and then this link to go back to the form. Keep in mind that all of the code we're seeing here is server-side. It's not client-side. All of this code is running in the server and is not running in the user's browser. That means that here we need to generate that HTML code. In this case, we're saying hello, nice to meet you, and then concatenating the user's name in the middle of that string. We have some static HTML, and then we have the beginning and end of our unordered list. Now we want to list out all the animals that the user selected. We'll use the for each function on the animals array, which will apply some function to each element of the array. We'll call each element animal, and for each animal, we'll use response.write, and we'll construct the list item using concatenation with the animal. After we've generated the unordered list, we have the link that will take the user back to the form. And note that we have to use different types of quotation marks. Here I have the double quote on the outside and the single quote on the inside. So this code works fine, but maybe we want to do something to clean up all of this, where there's this entanglement of JavaScript and HTML. Often we want to separate format from functionality. That is, we want to separate the appearance of what we're producing from the code that produces it. In this case, we want to separate the HTML from the JavaScript. In order to separate the JavaScript from the HTML, In Express, we can use a tool called EJS, or Embedded JS, or Embedded JavaScript. EJS is a view engine that combines data or static content with embedded JavaScript and executes the JavaScript to generate HTML. This means that our HTML can be rendered dynamically on the server and then sent back as content to the browser. EJS is a package that we would need to install using the command npm install EJS. So let's see how we would use EJS in our Express app, starting with the JavaScript code that we would need to write. There are many different view engines that we can use, and EJS is just one of them. And in our app, we would set the view engine to EJS. Then, rather than using the response write or send function, we would use the render function. The render function takes the name of the EJS file as its first argument. By default, the EJS files should go in the views subdirectory or folder, and we don't need to say .ejs at the end because it's understood. If we want to pass arguments to the EJS file, we do that using JavaScript objects. So now let's see what an EJS file looks like. Well, an EJS file is just an HTML file that has some JavaScript code embedded in it. It uses special tags, as shown here, to evaluate the JavaScript and then render it as HTML. And as I mentioned, EJS files should be in the views subdirectory of your Express project. In this example, we have a file called welcome.ejs, which is in the views subdirectory. And then in our EJS file, we use these tags to indicate that what's in between is JavaScript that should be evaluated and then shown as part of the HTML. In this case, the username would have come from an argument that was passed to it by the JavaScript that rendered this EJS file. Keep in mind that this is running on the server and not in the user's browser. That is, what we're doing here is generating the HTML that will send back to the browser as part of the HTTP response. Now, EJS allows us to execute any JavaScript within the page when we're generating the HTML page on the server. For instance, in this example, our JavaScript would call the render function on the response using welcome.ejs and would send the argument that this time includes two key value pairs, the username and a Boolean indicating is this user an administrator. As we saw in the previous example, we can evaluate the username using these tags. Here we see if we want to execute any arbitrary JavaScript, we use these tags and include the JavaScript inside. Now we're checking to see if isAdmin is true. Now, of course, we have to have the curly brace, and we need to have the closing curly brace in our JavaScript, and that closing curly brace must also be included in these tags. If isAdmin is true, then as part of the HTML, we'll also include this message here. So we've started to see how we can use EJS to separate the JavaScript and the HTML. Let's go back to our motivating example, where as part of handling the form, we want to echo back the data that the user sent, but we want to do that without tangling up all of our JavaScript and HTML within the index.js file. So here's the result of the form, and here was the code that generated it, as we saw earlier in this lesson. And all of this code is the code I'd like to remove. We do need to have the JavaScript code that gets the username out of the request body and converts the selected animals to an array. But all of this other code shown here is not really the code for the logic of our program, but is really just the rendering of the HTML. So we'll remove that entirely and replace it with the render function. We'll call response.render, and we'll specify that the EJS file that we want to render is showAnimals. Again, showAnimals.ejs would need to be in the views subdirectory. Then we'll pass a JavaScript object as the argument to that EJS file. That object will have a property called name, which has the value set to this variable that we got from the body of the request. It'll also have a property called animals, which is going to be this variable here. So at the top of the screen now, I'm just showing the code that we were just looking at. And now here at the bottom is the showAnimals.ejs file. Again, This code would need to be in the views subdirectory, and it needs to match the name of the string that we passed to the render function. The first thing we'll do is greet the user by including the name, and the name came as one of the arguments that was passed to the render function. Now in our EJS file, we do need to include some JavaScript to iterate over all of the animals that are in the array using the forEach function. The forEach function will be called on our animals array, which came from the argument when we called render, and for each animal, we're going to invoke this function that's going to create the list item tags and then put the name of the animal in between them. Last, you may remember in our JavaScript, we had to construct this link using different types of quotation marks. Here we don't have to worry about that anymore. It's just a regular link. EJS allows us to separate the JavaScript from the HTML, to separate the functionality from the format using .ejs files. We can use the HTTP response object's render function to convert the EJS file to static HTML. And in the EJS file, we can use the special tags that will execute JavaScript and generate HTML on the server.